My husband's entire family flew to the Bahamas for a vacation, forcing me to stay home alone to care for my father-in-law, who was paralyzed on one side of his body. In the middle of the night, he suddenly sat up, handed me assets worth $10 million, and revealed a secret that left me utterly frozen. That day, my husband's family had just left for their overseas trip. They departed full of laughter and excited chatter, while I was left behind in the vast, cold silence of their home. My sole duty was to care for my father-in-law, Mr. Arthur Kensington, a man who had been half paralyzed for years. Before leaving, my mother-in-law, Martha, stood at the door, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. "You take good care of him," she warned, each word a sharp command. "Don't mess this up. If anything happens to him, you'll answer to me." My husband David stood beside her without a word of defense for me. He just glanced over, his voice flat. "Don't think of this as a vacation for you, Sarah. This is your responsibility." With that, he turned, dragged his suitcase to the car, and didn't look back once. I stood there, my hands still damp from washing a towel for his father, a lump forming in my throat. Not a single person had asked if I was tired, if I could handle it, if I needed any help. To them, I was a shadow, a person who existed only to work and shoulder the burdens they didn't want. That evening, I changed Mr. Kensington's dressings and gave him a sponge bath just like any other day. He lay silently, his clouded eyes staring at the ceiling, unable to speak, only occasionally letting out a soft, muffled sound. I bent down to adjust his blanket. "You rest, Dad," I whispered. "I'm here." I didn't know if he understood, but I said it out of habit. Night fell, quickly plunging the large house into an almost terrifying quiet. There were no voices, no television, just the steady hum of the respiratory machine and the whistle of the wind through a window crack. I lay on the long sofa in the living room, not daring to sleep deeply, dozing in short bursts, terrified something might happen to him. Around 2 a.m., I jolted awake. There was a faint sound, like something bumping against something else. I sat, bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. I strained my ears. The sound was coming from my father-in-law's room. I scrambled to my feet, my steps feeling disconnected from the floor, my trembling hand gripping the doorknob. I pushed it open gently, and in the moment the door swung inward, the sight before me made me freeze in place. Mr. Kensington was sitting up in bed. Not lying down, not motionless, as he had been for years. He was sitting upright, his hands braced on the mattress, his eyes wide open and staring directly at me. I was rooted to the spot. "Dad." I stammered, my voice so shaky I barely recognized it. You can sit up." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his gaze no longer clouded but sharp and strangely alert. Then he slowly raised a hand and motioned for me to close the door to not let anyone know. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly shut the door and took slow, hesitant steps toward the bed, my mind still refusing to process what was happening. "Mr. Kensington looked directly at me, his voice low and heavy, each word carrying the weight of years. I was never completely paralyzed. That sentence hit me like a sledgehammer. I stood there, stunned into silence, feeling the world spin around me. He reached under his pillow, pulled out a folded sheaf of papers, and handed them to me with a trembling hand. I took them, unfolded them, and as my eyes scanned the words, my heart stopped. They were asset transfer documents valued at $10 million. I jerked my head up to look at him, my eyes wide. "Dad, this." He cut me off, speaking slowly. "I'm giving it all to you. Because you are the only one who has ever been truly kind to me." Before I could recover, he continued, his voice hoarse but chillingly cold. "The people you call your husband and your mother-in-law, they are the ones who have been poisoning me all these years." My ears began to ring. I couldn't hear anything clearly anymore. The papers in my hand shook violently. My mind was a complete blank. The man I called my husband, the woman I called my mother, were the ones who had harmed their own father. I wanted to ask, to deny it, to say he must be mistaken, but my throat was tight, unable to form a single word. I could only stand there, staring at the man before me, the man I had thought was weak and helpless for so long, now sitting tall, his eyes full of a painful clarity. I had no idea that this single moment would drag me into a terrifying secret I could never have imagined in my entire life. Holding the papers, my mind was a tangled mess. 1,000 questions flooded in at once. But another thought struck me. With even greater force, if what my father-in-law said was true, what kind of family had I been living in all these years? What kind of marriage had I entered? How deeply had I trusted these people, only to discover tonight that beneath the calm surface lay a world of darkness? My name is Sarah Johnson. I was born into an ordinary family. My parents were honest, hard-working people, not wealthy, but decent. From a young age, I was used to a frugal life to making do with what we had, never daring to ask for more. After finishing community college, I got a job as an accountant for a small company. It wasn't a glamorous career, and my salary was just enough to get by, but I was content. At least I could support myself without being a burden to anyone. I met David through a mutual acquaintance. A friend of my mother's mentioned a young man who seemed gentle, came from a stable family, had a good job, and was looking for a serious relationship. I wasn't very interested at first. I had never thought about getting married so young, but after a few dates, I started to let my guard down. The David I met then was completely different from the man I saw later. He spoke softly, always seemed mature and considerate. Every time we met, he'd ask if I had eaten if work was tiring. He'd text me to wear a jacket when it got cold. For a girl like me who hadn't experienced much of the world, these small gestures easily softened my heart. I remember once it was pouring rain and he waited outside my office for over half an hour just to drive me home, a gentle smile on his face. "I was worried you'd slip and fall driving alone," he said. It was that facade of kindness that made me believe I had found the right person. When David took me to meet his family, I felt even more certain of my luck. Their house was large and beautifully furnished. Everything looked expensive and well kept. My father-in-law had already had a stroke by then, and mostly stayed in bed or a chair, rarely speaking, his face perpetually weary. My mother-in-law, Martha, greeted me with a wide smile and pulled me inside by the hand. "This girl looks so sweet and good-natured," she said in a sugary voice. "We have everything we need in this house. All we ask is that you know your place." At the time, that phrase brought me relief. I thought knowing my place simply meant being polite, respecting my elders, and taking care of my husband and family. I never imagined those words would later become chains binding me to a host of invisible duties so heavy they were suffocating. After the wedding, I moved into their home. My heart was filled with both gratitude and determination. I knew my family's background wasn't as privileged as theirs, so I promised myself I would live in a way that was beyond reproach, so no one could say my parents hadn't raised me right. I woke up earlier than everyone else. I cooked, cleaned, did laundry, and managed the household meticulously. Sometimes, after finishing all the chores, my limbs would ache with exhaustion, but a single comment from Martha, like "Our daughter-in-law is certainly a hard worker," would make all the fatigue seem to fade away. But that peace didn't last long. A few months after the wedding, David began to change. He still went to work, ate his meals at home, and slept beside me, but the tenderness he once showed faded like watered-down wine. He became less talkative, coming home only to bury his face in his phone, or the TV, answering my questions with monosyllabic replies. Many nights I'd wait with dinner until 8 or 9 p.m. The food growing cold only for him to arrive, toss his coat on a chair, and say dismissively, "Work was busy. Don't ask so many questions." Of course it hurt, but I tried to comfort myself by thinking that men often have more pressure after getting married. Maybe he changed because of the stress. I continued to be patient, believing that if I just tried a little harder, our family would be happy. Around that time, the responsibility of caring for my father-in-law fell almost entirely on my shoulders, from feeding him and changing his clothes to bathing him and giving him his medication. If he coughed in the middle of the night, I was the one who had to run to his room. At first, I didn't mind. I thought he's already suffering so much from his illness. As his daughter-in-law, I should share the burden. But gradually, it all became my default responsibility, as if I were the only person in the house obligated to care for him. One day, I had a low fever and felt completely drained. I asked Martha if I could just rest for one afternoon. Her face immediately darkened. "That's your only job and you're already complaining. If you're sick, take some medicine and get back to it." "Who has time to wait on you?" Lying in bed, tears streamed down my face. But I wiped them away, telling myself she was probably just a difficult person. Aren't all mothers-in-law like that? In that house, the person who made me feel the most pity and confusion was my father-in-law. He rarely spoke, unable to form clear words, but his eyes were always filled with sadness, the sadness of someone trapped within their own body. Many times while I was feeding him oatmeal, he would stare at me intently, his lips moving as if he wanted to say something. Once he suddenly grabbed my hand, squeezing it so tightly it startled me. I leaned in. "What is it, Dad? Are you in pain?" But he only made a muffled sound in his throat, turned his face away, and his eyes reddened as if holding something back. At the time, I didn't understand. I just thought he was a lonely, sick man who needed more attention. So no matter how tired I was, I tried to care for him meticulously, because I genuinely felt for him. I still believed that if you live decently and treat others well, sooner or later, you'll receive kindness in return. But I was wrong. I still believed that if I just lived decently, everything would turn out fine. But I was wrong. The longer I lived there, the more I realized that some things in that house were not normal at all. I was just too naive at the time, forcing myself to believe that everything would pass if I just kept being patient. I remember one afternoon David was at work, and I had just finished washing some towels for my father-in-law when I heard Martha talking on the phone in the backyard. Her voice was very low, deliberately hushed. I didn't pay much attention at first, but as I passed the kitchen door, I clearly heard a sentence. Just let her take care of the old man. It works out for everyone. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. I didn't hear the beginning or the end of the conversation, nor did I know what worked out for everyone meant. But for some reason, that sentence stuck with me all day. It didn't sound like the way a wife would talk about her seriously ill husband, and it certainly didn't sound like the way a mother would talk about her daughter-in-law. It felt strange, but I brushed it aside. I didn't dare to ask, partly because I was afraid I had misunderstood, and partly because I knew that in this house someone like me had no right to question anything. Around that same time, David started to tighten his control over our finances. When we first got married, I was still working. My salary wasn't much, but it was enough for my personal expenses. Later, because caring for his father took up most of my time, I took a leave of absence from my company. I still had my savings in my personal account, but David found out. He brought it up during dinner, his tone as casual as an order. From now on, I'll manage the money in this house. If you need to buy something, just tell me. I looked up at him a little stunned, but that's my salary and my savings. David didn't get angry right away. He just put down his bowl and looked at me with cold eyes. I should be the one managing the money in this house. Women with money tend to cause trouble. Martha, sitting next to him, chimed in immediately. Men know how to handle important things. You just focus on your duties here at home. Her words left me speechless. I didn't argue further. But from that day on, my old salary, my savings, even the cash gifts my parents gave me for the wedding, David took it all, under the guise of managing it for us. Every time I needed to buy something for myself, from a new shirt to a box of cold medicine, I had to ask. One day I needed to buy feminine products, and didn't even have $20 in my wallet. I hesitantly asked my husband. He pulled out his wallet, handed me a few small bills, and said curtly, "Whatever you're buying, don't overspend." The feeling at that moment was humiliating, so humiliating I wished the ground would swallow me whole. I started to understand that in this house I not only had no voice, but I also had no control over my own life. I was like someone living on charity, even though I was the one shouldering most of the housework, the nursing care, and running all the errands until I was exhausted. Once, after nearly half a year of being cooped up at home, I mustered the courage to suggest to Martha that we hire a part-time nurse to help with my father-in-law so I could go back to work part-time. I chose my words very carefully. Mom, I was thinking if we had someone to help during the day, I could go back to work. It would bring in a little extra money and ease the burden on David. I hadn't even finished my sentence when her face darkened, her tone as sharp as a slap. You want to abandon your father-in-law to die? Are we so short on money that you have to work? Or are you just tired of serving him and looking for an excuse? I sat frozen, not knowing how to respond. What baffled me the most was that they always scolded me as if I were trying to escape my responsibilities, yet they themselves were frequently absent. Martha was always out visiting friends, going to church events, or having lunch with her various groups. David left in the morning and came home late at night. Even on weekends, he would be out from morning till midnight. Whenever I needed a hand, like when my father-in-law was in pain or running a fever in the middle of the night, there was never anyone around. The house was so large, yet in the end it was just me and a paralyzed man in a bed. It was this absurdity that began to make me feel uneasy. If they truly loved him, why would they neglect him so easily? If they considered his care so important, why did the entire burden fall on me, the one person with no blood relation to him? Then another incident occurred. A small thing, but it was like a thorn that embedded itself deep in my mind. One day, while I was giving my father-in-law a sponge bath, I noticed a dark purple bruise on his bicep, as if from a heavy impact. I paused, leaning in for a closer look. How could a man confined to his bed injure himself like that? I asked urgently. Dad, what happened to your arm? Does it hurt? Did someone bump into you? He didn't answer. He just looked at me, his eyes suddenly wider than usual. I had never seen such a clear emotion in a sick person's eyes before. It was fear, a real, palpable fear that flickered for a moment before he immediately hid it by turning his face away and squeezing his eyes shut as if he didn't want me to ask any more questions. I sat there for a long time, the washcloth still in my hand, my mind in turmoil. That bruise wasn't natural. The look in his eyes wasn't that of an unconscious person. He knew. He was scared, and he didn't dare to speak. From that day on, I started paying closer attention. I didn't dare to draw any conclusions because I had no proof, but the more I observed, the more I felt a strange atmosphere in the house, as if something was silently festering beneath the surface of our daily routines. Meanwhile, David grew more and more abrasive. Once I pointed out that one of my father-in-law's medications had been bought in the wrong dosage. David whirled around and shouted at me right in the living room. "You live off us, so you don't get to have an opinion." His words were like a knife stabbing me in the chest. I stood there, frozen, a mix of shame and pain washing over me. But I still had to turn away, swallowing my tears. I kept telling myself I had to endure it for the sake of the family, that every marriage has its difficulties, that women living with their in-laws sometimes can't afford to be confrontational. But the more I tried to convince myself, the deeper a strange feeling grew inside me. A vague but heavy sense that something was fundamentally wrong in this house, getting worse with each passing day. I had chosen silence, but a nameless anxiety began to take root in my heart. And from that vague anxiety, things in my husband's house began to go downhill very quickly, like a curtain being slowly pulled back to reveal the true faces of the people I had once considered family. After the accumulation of all these small incidents, my in-laws barely bothered to maintain any pretense with me anymore. If when I first married, Martha's harsh words were veiled in insinuation later on, she hardly bothered to hide her contempt. She would say things right to my face as casually as if she were talking to a stranger, with no regard for whether I was hurt or not. I remember one evening at dinner. I had just finished feeding my father-in-law his soup and rushed down to the kitchen to set the table. I was exhausted, my back aching, but I still forced myself to sit at the table to make a full family appearance, because Martha hated it when the daughter-in-law was absent from meals. The moment I picked up my fork, she looked me up and down, her voice icy. "You should be grateful we're feeding you. Don't even dream of asking for more." I froze, not understanding what I had done wrong to deserve that. I mumbled, "I haven't asked for anything." She snorted, served David some food, and continued, "Not asking, but you walk around with a long face all day. You eat here, you sleep here, you don't have to worry about the electricity or water bills. What more could you possibly want?" Before I could say a word, David chimed in, his tone chillingly indifferent. "Mom's right. You should know your place, Sarah. Don't think you're so important in this house." His words made my hands freeze. I was sitting right next to my husband, but the distance between us felt like a frigid chasm. I no longer saw any trace of support or compassion in him. The man who had once waited for me in the rain after work could now sit there with his mother, rubbing salt in his wife's wounds without even blinking. From that day on, I lived in that house constantly on edge. When my phone rang, I didn't dare answer it right away. When old friends texted to check in, I would wait a long time before replying. Once my best friend called repeatedly, because she had heard I'd been on leave from work for a while and was worried about me. Before I could even answer, Martha came in from somewhere, glanced at the screen and snarled, "What kind of friends call at all hours? Focus on this house. Don't be getting ideas about socializing." I silently silenced the ringer and put the phone in my pocket. After that, I almost completely cut off contact with everyone. Not because I wanted to, but because I was too tired to explain, too ashamed to describe my situation, and too afraid of seeing the looks on my in-laws' faces every time my phone rang. There were days I worked from dawn till dusk, a whirlwind of cooking, medicine schedules, meals, laundry, and then rushing to my father-in-law's room. I lost a noticeable amount of weight, and my eyes were always ringed with dark circles from lack of sleep. But in my mother-in-law's eyes, none of that mattered. She only cared if I had done enough, if I was fast enough, if it was done to her liking. One time I was at the stove making soup when a wave of dizziness hit me hard. I had barely slept for days and had been eating poorly. The moment I stood up, my whole body swayed. I just managed to grab the edge of the counter before everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the cold kitchen tiles, my head throbbing. The acrid smell of burnt soup filled the air from the blackened pot. Martha was standing over me, her arms crossed, not a hint of concern on her face, just a smirk. "Nice performance," she said. I looked at her, my throat tight. I wanted to say that I was really tired, that I had really fainted, that I wasn't acting. But looking at her cold, indifferent eyes, I knew it was pointless. In this house, if I fell, if I collapsed from exhaustion, if I was in pain, I would only be seen as a nuisance. It was in that moment that I began to realize a bitter truth. I wasn't a daughter-in-law in this family. I wasn't even family. I was just an unpaid housekeeper, kept around to handle the dirty, tiring jobs that no one else wanted to touch. The only difference was that a housekeeper gets a salary. I got nothing but criticism, contemptuous looks, and the label of a freeloader thrown at me whenever they wanted to shut me up. Then, one day, everything shifted to another level. I was changing my father-in-law's shirt when I heard the sound of suitcases being rolled in the living room. I went out to see David and Martha, sorting through closed documents and passports spread all over the table. The atmosphere was strange, a mix of excitement and urgency, completely different from the usual heavy mood. Before I could understand what was happening, David spoke, his eyes still glued to his phone. "Next week, the whole family is going on a trip abroad for a week." I stood stunned. "The whole family? What do you mean?" Martha looked up and announced it as if it had been decided long ago. "Me and David are going. The tickets are booked, the hotel is confirmed." I was speechless for a few seconds before I could ask, "What about Dad?" David's reply was curt. "You'll stay home and take care of him." I looked at them, thinking I must have misheard. "But why didn't you discuss it with me first? A week isn't a short time. What if something happens?" Martha's brow furrowed immediately. "What could happen with you here? Or do you want to come along too?" I tried to stay calm and say the only thing that made sense. "If that's the case, why don't we put Dad in a nursing facility or hire a nurse in shifts? It would be safer." David's head snapped up, his voice sharp. "That's not necessary. You being here is enough." I wanted to say more, but looking at my husband's eyes, I knew everything had already been decided. They hadn't asked for my opinion, didn't care if I agreed or not. They were just informing me, ordering me to take on this task, as if it were a matter of course. In the following days, the house was filled with an unusual buzz. They went shopping, prepared their outfits, called friends to brag about their itinerary, laughing and talking cheerfully. I, on the other hand, was as busy as ever, caring for a sick man while watching them excitedly prepare for their trip, my heart heavy. I wasn't envious that they were going. What hurt me was that in their eyes, my father-in-law was just a cumbersome object to be left in my care. The day they left, just before walking out the door, Martha turned back, pointed a finger at my face and spat out each word. "Remember this carefully. If anything happens to him, you won't be able to pay the price." I stood in the doorway, watching David load the suitcases into the car, watching Martha get in with a gleeful expression, and a strange emptiness filled me. There was shame, there was bitterness, but more than anything, there was a feeling I couldn't name, as if I was being abandoned in a house devoid of any warmth. And it was at that very moment, as I turned back to adjust my father-in-law's blanket, that I caught his eye. His gaze was different from usual. It was no longer tired, no longer vacant. It was a deep, expectant look, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. I never imagined their trip would be the very opportunity for a horrifying secret to be revealed. But before that secret came to light, I had to endure several days stretched as taut as a violin string. Days that still make my chest ache with fear, just thinking about them. From the moment Martha and David left, the house felt larger but also colder and more frightening. All the household duties fell on me. The moment I opened my eyes in the morning, I would run to my father-in-law's room to check if he had a fever, if his breathing was steady. Then it was down to the kitchen to make soup, prepare medication, do laundry, give him a sponge bath, clean the house, lock the gates, and check all the doors and windows. I was a one-woman whirlwind in that huge house, so tired at times that I had to lean against a wall just to catch my breath. The days were hard, but the nights were when I barely dared to sleep. The long sofa in the living room became my bed for those few days. I would doze off for a bit, only to jolt awake and listen for any sound from his room. A soft cough or a slightly more forceful turn was enough to have me up and running. I don't know if it was genuine worry or if a deeper fear had begun to set in. The feeling had been festering since they left, growing stronger each day. I just felt like something was wrong, something was waiting to happen in this house. I just couldn't put my finger on it yet. Then, on the third day, my worst fears began to materialize. That morning, as usual, I took out my father-in-law's medication to sort it by dosage. I did this every day, so I knew every pill, every color, every amount by heart. But when I opened the pill organizer, I froze. The two opaque white pills in the morning compartment looked different. At a glance, they were similar, but the size was slightly off, and the color was paler. I frowned, picking up the blister pack to examine it more closely. My heart dropped when I saw the printed text on the foil didn't match the prescription the doctor had previously written. I quickly pulled out the old prescription to compare. The more I looked, the colder my hands became. The drug names were similar, but the strength was different, and the dosage had been changed. My head started spinning. I checked the entire bag of medication and discovered that not just one but two types of pills had been switched. Not randomly, but very skillfully. Anyone not paying close attention would never have noticed. I sat there stunned for a few seconds, the blister pack in my hand, my heart racing. Who changed them? When and why? I immediately called David. The phone rang for a long time before he picked up his voice, clearly annoyed, as if I had interrupted something fun. I hadn't even finished my sentence, just managed to say, "David, I think there's something wrong with Dad's medication," when he cut me off sharply. "Don't jump to conclusions, Sarah. Are you so bored at home that you're just making things up?" I tried to stay calm and explain more clearly. "I'm not making it up. I compared it with the old prescription. The dosage is really different. I'm afraid it could be dangerous." David cut me off again. "I told you, just do what you're supposed to do. Stop trying to play doctor." It didn't end there. Just as I was still holding the phone, Martha called. Her shrill voice, undoubtedly relayed by David, came through the line. She didn't ask any questions, just started yelling. "Your job is to follow instructions, not to be clever. You're home for a few days and you think you know everything. The doctors prescribed the medicine. What are you scrutinizing it for?" I bit my lip until it hurt. If before I had tried to believe they were just callous and indifferent, at that moment a very real fear ignited within me. It was no longer a vague unease. I started to consider the most terrible possibility: were they intentionally trying to harm their own father? The thought had barely crossed my mind when a shiver went down my spine. I wanted to dismiss it as too cruel, too absurd. What kind of child would do that to their own parent? But then I remembered Martha's slip of the tongue, my father-in-law's terrified eyes, the way they had abandoned him to go on vacation without a second thought. One by one, the pieces fit together into a chilling puzzle. From that day on, I didn't dare to give him the medication right away. I carefully saved every blister pack, every pill, took pictures of everything, and cross-referenced them with the old prescription. Any medication I found suspicious, I temporarily stopped, only giving him the ones I was sure were safe. My mind was in turmoil, but on the outside I had to pretend everything was normal, as if nothing had happened. Then the following evening, what I dreaded most finally happened. It was around 9 p.m. I had just fed my father-in-law about half a bowl of soup when I noticed his hand started to tremble violently. At first I thought he was just tired and was about to put the bowl down to let him rest. But just a few seconds later his face turned pale, his lips started twitching, and his whole body began to stiffen. The spoon in my hand clattered to the floor. "Dad, Dad," I cried, lunging forward to support him. He was having a mild seizure, but for someone already so frail, even that was enough to send me into a panic. I was shaking so badly my limbs felt disconnected, but I forced myself to remember the first aid I had learned. I turned his head to the side, loosened his collar, and made sure he wouldn't hit anything, all while sobbing uncontrollably. The seizure didn't last long, but to me every second felt like an hour. When he finally calmed down, his breathing was still shallow and weak. I nearly collapsed right there beside his bed. I hugged his shoulder, tears streaming down my face, all the frustration, fear, and despair that had built up over the past few days bursting forth. "Dad," I choked out, my voice hoarse. "I don't know what to do anymore. I really don't know what to do." He couldn't speak, but he looked at me for a long time. It was a look I still remember vividly. It held pain, exhaustion, and a heart-wrenching gratitude, as if for the first time in this house he felt someone truly cared whether he lived or died. Then his hand slowly moved to grasp mine. The grip was surprisingly strong for a sick man. I looked up at him and saw his eyes were red. He didn't let go, holding on for a long time, as if he were wrestling with a momentous decision in his mind. That night, I barely slept. I sat in the living room, my eyes fixed on the door to his room. I had a strange premonition, heavy and clear, that after tonight something would change completely. And then, in the middle of the night, in the thick, oppressive silence of the house, I heard a noise from his room. In that instant, I crossed the line from a passive victim into a fight from which I could not turn back. I walked into the room to see my father-in-law sitting upright in bed, his hand still resting on the edge of the blanket, his eyes sharp and bright in the dim yellow glow of the nightlight. I felt like I had turned to stone. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would never have believed that the man who had lain silently on this bed for years, enduring everything, could now sit up and speak to me in such a clear, alert voice. While I was still frozen in shock, he gently pulled my hand, his voice low but firm. "Listen to me carefully. We don't have much time." His words snapped me out of my stupor. I quickly pulled a chair to the bedside, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. He took a few slow breaths and looked directly at me. His eyes were no longer the tired, helpless eyes I saw every day. They were the eyes of a man who had endured too much, suffered too long, and was now forced to reveal everything. He told me to hand him the glass of water on the nightstand. He took a sip before speaking, his voice raspy. "I'm not completely paralyzed, Sarah, not like everyone thinks. Years ago, I was poisoned by my own wife and son. My mouth fell open, but no words came out. The statement was too horrific. I could only stare at him, my hands and feet turning to ice. He continued each word, slow but clear. At first, I thought it was a real stroke. My body grew weaker, my limbs went numb, my mind was always foggy. But over time, I realized something wasn't right. My spells of weakness didn't feel like a natural illness. Some days I'd feel a little better, more alert after eating. But then, right after taking my medicine, I would be completely out of it like a zombie. My voice trembled as I asked why. Why would they do that to their own father? The question had barely left my lips when my eyes stung with tears. I couldn't comprehend how a wife and son could be so cruel. Mr. Kensington gave a bitter laugh. A sound more painful than a sob. For money. For all these assets. For that $10 million and much more. He gestured with his chin toward the papers still clutched in my hand. I looked down at the transfer documents which I had gripped so tightly they were now wrinkled. He explained that the money was just the portion Martha and David knew about, the part that made them most impatient. But what truly worried them were the larger assets, several plots of land, old business shares, and other important documents that he had not yet transferred to anyone. As long as he was alive, they had to be careful. As long as he was lucid, they couldn't take everything. I listened, goosebumps breaking out on my skin. It turned out that what I had mistaken for indifference and neglect was just the surface of a conspiracy that had been going on for years. I remembered every glance, every word, every time they had been insistent about his medication, every time they had left him in my care, only to criticize me later. It all clicked together into a terrifying, suffocating chain of events. He said that because he realized he was being harmed, he was forced to pretend. At first, he had tried to resist to speak out. But the more he fought, the stronger the drugs became, and the weaker he got. Once he tried to grab David's hand, making sounds to signal that he knew. That very evening, his medication was changed, and he was unconscious for 2 days. After that, he understood. If he revealed that he knew the truth, he might not live to see another day. So he lay still, pretending he was unaware, pretending he was just a living shell waiting for others to decide his fate. I sat there listening, tears falling without me even realizing it. No wonder his eyes had looked so strange so many times, as if he wanted to speak but forced the words back down. No wonder he had sometimes squeezed my hand so tightly his eyes red, unable to utter a word. It wasn't that he didn't want to speak. It was that he didn't dare. Because in this house, if he showed even a sliver of lucidity, he might not have survived to sit before me today. Then he looked me straight in the eye, his voice dropping even lower. Their trip wasn't a coincidence. They left to create a space to leave you here alone so that if anything happened, it would be easy to pin it on you. I shivered, feeling as if a bucket of ice water had been dumped over my head. I stammered, "You mean they were planning to kill you?" He didn't answer right away. He just gave a very slight nod, but his eyes turned hard as stone. "Not just me." He paused for a beat, then added slowly and distinctly, "If you get in their way, you won't be safe either." My limbs went weak. Suddenly I remembered the switched medication, the seizure last night, the way David had yelled at me over the phone when I discovered the discrepancy. My intuition hadn't been wrong. I wasn't overthinking things. I was living in a house where a human life could be calculated like a debt. Just as I was reeling from the shock, Mr. Kensington slowly leaned over and reached into a seam in the mattress, pulling out a small black USB drive. He placed it in my palm, his voice a mere whisper. "The proof is in here. Everything is recorded." My head snapped up. He explained that he had an old trusted contact secretly help him install a few things to save some audio clips and images over a long period. They couldn't capture everything, but it was enough to prove that certain events were no coincidence. Before letting go, he gave my fingers a light squeeze and said the last words that haunt me to this day: trust no one. Not even the people you think are harmless. I sat there, frozen, the USB drive in my hand, feeling as heavy as a stone. The room was still just the two of us, and the dim yellow light. But everything around me had changed. I was no longer the silently suffering daughter-in-law. I was no longer just a bystander to someone else's cruelty. I had been pulled into the center of a real battle. where one wrong step could cost me my life. I clutched the USB drive, and for the first time in my life I understood what it felt like to be scared, breathless. I held the USB drive for a long time until my fingertips went numb. My father-in-law had already lain back down, resuming his usual frail posture, as if the person who had just sat up and told me those horrifying things wasn't him. But I knew after that night I could never look at this house the same way again. It wasn't a home. It was a trap waiting for me to make one mistake. I took the USB drive to my room, locked the door, and only then dared to plug it into the old laptop I used for household bookkeeping. My hands were shaking so much it took several tries to get it into the port. The screen lit up, showing a single folder. I clicked it open, and the moment the first audio recording played, my entire body went rigid. It was Martha's voice, unmistakable. The same shrill, grating tone, but this time it wasn't scolding me in public. It was the voice of someone carefully calculating their next move. "Just let her take care of the old man," she said. "When it's over, we can just kick her out." The words sent a chill down my spine. I sat motionless, staring at the screen even though it was just audio. The second clip was even more chilling. This time it was David's voice, deeper, quieter, but every word was like a knife in my ear. "If he dies sooner than expected, all the better. Less trouble." I heard that, and my hand on the desk started to tremble uncontrollably. I had been hurt by my husband's coldness, shamed by my mother-in-law's contempt. But none of that compared to how I felt now. The man I had shared a bed with, the man the world saw as a devoted son, could speak about his own father that way, his voice as casual as if he were discussing the weather. I don't know how long I sat there. The more I listened, the harder my heart pounded, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. The subsequent files contained muffled sounds, blurry images from a corner of a room enough to show Martha and David whispering in the hallway many times. They talked about documents, assets, medication. Not everything was crystal clear, but piecing it all together, there was only one conclusion: they had been planning this for a long time, so long that it had become a calculated scheme, not a spontaneous thought. Just as I was reeling, the phone on the table suddenly buzzed, making me jump. The screen lit up, husband calling. It wasn't a regular call, but a video call. My heart seized. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, my hands clammy. Finally, I took a deep breath and answered. David's face appeared on the screen. Behind him were the warm lights of some luxury hotel. He was smiling, the kind of smile an outsider would mistake for concern. But now, all I saw was a grotesque facade. "Everything okay at home?" he asked immediately. "Is Dad still doing all right?" His voice was gentle, even feigning worry. If this were me a few months ago, I might have felt a flicker of warmth. But now, every word sounded like an interrogation. I forced my face to remain as neutral as possible. "Everything's fine," I said curtly. David stared at me through the screen for a long time. His gaze made it hard to breathe. It wasn't the look of a husband checking on his wife. It was the look of someone trying to gauge how much the other person knew. Then his lips were still smiling, but his eyes turned cold. He spoke very slowly. "Just remember, don't do anything stupid." I froze. There was no mistaking his meaning, no beating around the bush. It was a warning, a threat wrapped in a calm exterior. I gripped the phone until my knuckles were white, pretending not to understand. "What do you mean by that?" David smirked faintly. "Nothing. I just don't like it when people meddle in my family's business." With that, he hung up. The screen went dark, but I sat there for a long time, feeling as if a cold blade had just been pressed against my throat. That night, I became even more cautious. I rechecked the front door, the windows, the back door, and did a full sweep of the house before going to my father-in-law's room. As I passed the kitchen, something felt off. The back door, which I distinctly remembered bolting, was now slightly ajar, not wide, but enough for a draft to slip in and make the thin curtains sway in the darkness. I stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, my heart pounding. I clearly remembered locking that door myself this afternoon, even pulling on it to make sure it was secure. There was no way it could have opened on its own. I tiptoed closer and saw a faint, muddy scuff mark on the tiled floor near the door. It was faint, but it was enough to know someone had been through here. Goosebumps erupted all over my skin. While I thought I was alone in this house, someone had been inside, or at least had tried to get in. I immediately ran back to check the medicine cabinet. The top shelf was untouched, but tucked in the very back corner behind some boxes of gauze was a small brown bottle I had never seen before. It wasn't in its usual place, and it wasn't a type of medicine I had been using. I picked it up and read the label. My heart plummeted. It wasn't a vitamin, not a fever reducer. It was a powerful sedative. I didn't remember ever having this in the house. At that point, I had no more doubts. They had a plan prepared from afar. They weren't here, but their hands were reaching into every corner of this house. It could have been the old housekeeper, a familiar doctor, or anyone on their side. But it was clear my father-in-law and I were not safe. I grabbed the bottle and ran straight to his room. As soon as I closed the door, I leaned in close and whispered, "Dad, they've started." Mr. Kensington, who had been lying with his eyes closed, opened them immediately. I showed him the bottle, quickly recounting the story of the ajar back door and David's phone call. He looked at the bottle, then at me, without panic or surprise. Instead, the corner of his mouth twisted into a cold smile. His voice was calm, almost eerily so. "Good. Then it's our turn." I looked at him and was momentarily stunned. For the first time since I married into this family, I no longer saw a sick man waiting to be cared for. The man in that bed with his cold, clear eyes and a voice as hard as steel was like someone who had been calculating, enduring, and waiting for the right moment to flip the entire chessboard. And as for me, sitting beside him in that silent room, I knew one thing for certain: from now on, every wrong move could be fatal. Because of that very night, while I was still shaking with fear, my father-in-law looked me straight in the eye and laid out the first part of his plan. He told me I had to pretend I knew nothing. I had to continue caring for him as usual, still taking out the new pills they had arranged, letting everything appear normal. There was only one difference: I had to secretly switch the pills. The suspicious ones would not be given to him. I heard this, and my throat went dry. My hand holding the bottle trembled so much I nearly dropped it. I'm afraid I can't do it," I stammered. It was the honest truth. All my life, I had only known how to endure, to be patient, to bow my head, and let things pass. I had never been in a high-stakes game where one wrong move could mean losing everything. Mr. Kensington just kept looking at me. His gaze didn't soften, but it held a clarity that forced me to be clear-headed as well. He spoke slowly. "If you don't do this, you will be the next one they eliminate." His words sent a chill through me. There was no turning back. I glanced at the bed, at the man who had been forced by his own wife and son to lie there like a log for years, then back at the bottle in my hand. Finally, I bit my lip and nodded. The very next morning, I began to follow his instructions precisely. On the surface, nothing changed. I still took out the medication, sorted it into the daily organizer, and placed it on the tray as usual. I put on a performance of being exhausted and worried, but when I brought the tray into his room, I secretly swapped the suspicious pills with the old ones I had hidden. My movements were so slow, I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. One wrong look, one unusual gesture, and I could be discovered instantly. The entire day passed in a state of high tension. I didn't dare breathe too loudly, didn't dare leave the door ajar, and certainly didn't dare leave my father-in-law's room for too long. Every time the phone rang, I jumped. Every time there was a noise outside, I thought someone had returned. I was beginning to understand what it felt like to be constantly watched, even if I couldn't see the person watching me. The following night, that fear became reality. It was well past midnight. I had moved the sofa from the living room closer to the hallway leading to his room. I left only one small, dim light on in the house, just enough to see by. I pulled a blanket over myself and pretended to be asleep, but my mind was acutely aware of every tiny sound. Then I heard a very faint click, so soft that if I hadn't been holding my breath to listen, I would have missed it. It was the sound of the back door closing. My heart leaped into my throat. Cold sweat prickled my neck. I remained perfectly still, not daring to move, just peeking through a tiny slit in the blanket. From the end of the hallway, a dark shadow glided past, moving silently, clearly not a common burglar, but someone who knew their way around this house. The figure paused for a few seconds in front of my father-in-law's door, then gently opened it and slipped inside. I lay frozen on the sofa, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to jump up and rush in, but I remembered his words: "Don't alert them. Let them think you don't know." So I continued to lie still, my hands clenched so tightly under the blanket they went numb. The door to his room had only opened a crack before closing again. Inside, there was complete silence. That silence was the most terrifying part. I didn't know what the person was doing, how long they would be, or if they were touching him. Every second stretched into an eternity. After what felt like a few minutes, the door opened again. The shadow slipped out, moved quickly down the hall, and disappeared toward the back of the house. A moment later, I heard the faint click of the door closing again. Only when all sound had vanished did I dare to sit up. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to run to his room. He was lying still, his eyes closed, as if asleep. I quickly shut the door, rushed to his bedside, and whispered, my voice trembling, "Dad, are you okay?" He opened his eyes almost instantly. They were alert but icy. He just shook his head slightly and gestured for me to be silent. I didn't dare ask more. Only near dawn, when we were certain no one was coming back, did he fully open his eyes and say very softly, "They were checking to see if the medicine is working." My legs nearly gave out from under me. The person who had snuck in last night wasn't a thief or an intimidator. They had come to see if a sick man was weakening according to their plan. It was in that moment that I truly understood the level of danger had far surpassed anything I had imagined. This wasn't a family dispute or a verbal argument. This was a real trap built with cruelty and greed where human life was coldly weighed like a number. And at that moment, something inside me changed. I no longer saw myself as just a cornered victim. If I kept being afraid, I would just be prey waiting to be devoured. I sat for a long time by his bed, then picked up my phone. For the first time, I proactively called David. He answered quickly, his voice still casual. "What is it?" I tried to keep my voice as calm as possible, though my palms were slick with sweat. "Dad is much weaker." After I said it, I held my breath, waiting for his reaction. There was a few seconds of silence on the other end, then a soft chuckle from David. A light sound, but it made my heart turn to ice. "Oh," he said. "Well, that's good then." Just 5 words, but they felt like a blade twisting in my chest. No follow-up questions, no surprise, no instructions. That man no longer saw his father as a human being. In his mind, Arthur Kensington getting weaker meant his plan was succeeding. I hung up and sat motionless for a long time. But strangely, the tears didn't come. Perhaps when the pain is too great, you can't cry right away. I stared at the dark screen of my phone, then at my father-in-law lying silently in bed, and in a moment of absolute clarity I knew I had changed. I was no longer Sarah Johnson, the woman who only knew how to grit her teeth and endure. From that moment on, I started to act. I would act for them, showing them I was still the obedient daughter-in-law, the weak woman, the person who knew nothing beyond cooking and medicine. I thought I was just pretending, but I never expected that very performance would draw them out of the shadows even faster. After that phone call, David began calling with an unusual frequency. Before a whole day might pass without a single text from him. Now he called in the morning, at noon, and at night. Sometimes he was direct. Other times he beat around the bush as if afraid I would catch on. Every time I answered, I had to remind myself to maintain the weary, panicked voice of a woman struggling alone with a gravely ill patient. On one call, as soon as I said hello, he asked, "How's Dad today?" I replied softly. "Still weak. He ate less than yesterday." There was a very brief pause on his end, then he asked, "Any fever? Did he say anything?" I bit my lip, suppressing a wave of disgust, and gave him the answer he wanted to hear. "He's very tired. He's barely opened his eyes." The more I reported his deteriorating condition, the more frequent the calls from David and Martha became. They had no idea that with every impatient question they were revealing another layer of their deception to me. An outsider might have thought they were children, worried about their aging father. Only I knew that behind those questions was the anxious anticipation of conspirators waiting to see if their plan was on track. One day, Martha called, right at lunchtime, her voice feigning urgency. "Have you changed his clothes? Is his body cold? Last night I thought his breathing sounded very heavy." I held the phone, my eyes on my father-in-law lying silently in bed, and replied, "Yes, he's definitely weaker. This morning I tried to feed him some soup, but he had a hard time swallowing." As soon as I finished, there was a brief silence, then she blurted out quickly, "Okay, well, just let him rest. Don't go calling any doctors." She hung up immediately. I sat there, stunned for a moment, a deeper chill settling in my heart. A wife who was genuinely worried about her husband would be frantically calling doctors upon hearing he was worse. But her first concern was that I wouldn't call anyone. That afternoon, while my father-in-law was sleeping, I went back to the laptop and opened the remaining folders on the USB drive. The first time I had only been able to listen to the first few clips before shutting it down, but now I knew I couldn't be afraid forever. I needed to hear everything, see everything, to understand just how deep this pit was. I scrolled to another audio file named with a string of numbers representing a date. When I clicked play, at first there was only the sound of a door opening and closing, the soft clink of glasses. Then a man's voice spoke. It was so familiar it made the hair on my arms stand up. I shot upright in my chair. It was the voice of my father-in-law's physician, Dr. Evans. For years, this man had made regular house calls, always speaking in a calm, gentle tone, wearing his white-rimmed glasses, his face the epitome of a caring professional. He had even once told me kindly, caring for a long-term patient is very difficult. Make sure you take care of yourself. That's why when I heard his voice on that recording I couldn't believe my ears. Martha's voice came through very low. The old dosage isn't working. He's still more lucid than I thought. Dr. Evans' voice replied, steady and cold. If you want him to weaken gradually, we have to increase the dose, but it can't be too obvious. Let me switch to another type. The effect is slower, more controllable. Immediately after, David's voice cut in. Just make sure no one gets suspicious. Especially Sarah. She's been paying too much attention lately. I was frozen. My ears were ringing. My eyes were glued to the screen, but everything was a blur. I mumbled out loud to no one in particular, could the doctor be bought too? The question had barely escaped my lips when I realized how bitterly ridiculous it sounded. The doctor. The one person who should have been helping Mr. Kensington stay alive was actually the one helping his family slowly and cleanly extinguish his life. I took the USB drive and went straight to his room. He was lying on his side, his eyes half closed. The moment he saw my pale face, his eyes opened fully. I sat down and played the recording for him. He listened to the whole thing without much expression, only nodding slightly when I asked in a trembling voice, "You knew about Dr. Evans too," he replied softly. "They don't do anything without being prepared." With that, he turned his face to stare at the ceiling. His words were quiet but so heavy they made me feel suffocated. It was only then that I truly understood. This wasn't a sudden burst of greed. It wasn't just a cruel mother-in-law and a heartless husband turning evil. No, this was a meticulously planned conspiracy that had been in motion for a very long time. There was someone to switch the medicine, someone to watch the house, and someone to play the role of a doctor who would reach their desired conclusion. Every link in the chain had been forged. And I, the daughter-in-law who only knew how to bow her head, had unwittingly stepped right into the center of their trap. Late that afternoon, as I was in the backyard gathering the dry laundry, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I wiped my hands on my shirt and opened it. It was a single line. "You should stay quiet if you don't want trouble." I stood frozen by the clothesline. The afternoon breeze felt frigid against my skin. There was no name, no exclamation point, no insults. It was the calm, concise nature of the message that was so terrifying. It wasn't the threat of an impulsive person. It was the warning of someone who knew exactly where I was, what I was doing, and that I had touched something I shouldn't have. I looked around the backyard, up at the balcony toward the front gate and the surrounding fence. The familiar house suddenly felt alien and menacing. I had never been so scared of it. Every window, every dark corner, every long hallway seemed to have eyes. I quickly grabbed the laundry basket, went inside and locked the door, my heart racing. For the first time since I had moved in, this no longer felt like a home. It was a cage, and my father-in-law and I were trapped inside. That night, I sat by Mr. Kensington's bed for a long time. The only sounds were the slow whir of the fan, his breathing, and the frantic beat of my own heart. I leaned in, my voice low but more resolute than ever before. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to act." Mr. Kensington was silent for a moment, then he turned to look at me. His eyes were no longer those of a man merely trying to survive another day. They were the eyes of someone who had been waiting to hear those exact words from me. He replied, his voice deep and firm. "You're right. It's time for them to pay." I sat there, my hands unconsciously clenching into fists. For so long I thought silence would keep the peace, that patience would preserve a home. But it was only then that I understood my silence had been the very thing that nourished their cruelty. My silence had been the very thing that nourished their cruelty. Perhaps that's why when I heard my father-in-law say those words, I no longer felt the cowering fear of the past few days. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my chest, but on top of it another feeling was growing stronger. It was the certainty that if I continued to endure, it wouldn't just be my father-in-law who would die. They would eventually drive me to a dead end as well. That night, Mr. Kensington had me pull my chair close. "When they get back," he whispered, each word carefully considered, "we have to flip the board on them immediately." I held my breath as he continued, his gaze strangely alert. "The plan is, I'm going to fake my death." I was stunned. Despite all the horrific things he had told me, I never imagined he would dare to take such a step. I shook my head immediately, my voice coming out in a panicked rush. "Dad, that's too dangerous. What if something goes wrong? What if they do something reckless?" I spoke in a torrent, my throat dry. Just the thought of staging a death in this very house made my limbs feel weak. But Mr. Kensington remained unnervingly calm. He leaned back against the pillows, his eyes fixed on the dark window. "To catch a wolf," he said slowly, "you have to go into its den." His words were quiet, but they made my skin crawl. He wasn't speaking like a man, making a desperate last-ditch effort. He was speaking like someone who had thought this through for a long time, who had backed himself into this final corner, and understood that if he didn't choose this path, there would be no other chances. I sat in silence for a long time, my mind racing. After a while, he explained that we couldn't do this alone. There was one person he still trusted, his former lawyer, who had handled many important documents for him in the past. His name was Mr. Howard Vance. This man hadn't been involved with the family for years, so Martha and David wouldn't suspect him. Mr. Kensington told me I had to contact Mr. Vance in secret, deliver the USB drive to him by hand, no suspicious texts, no calls from my own phone, and absolutely no one could find out. The next morning I waited until almost noon before making an excuse to go out and buy more supplies for my father-in-law. Before I left, I locked his room securely, arranged his pillows and blankets as usual, and then left with my purse. I had hidden the USB drive in the lining of the bag. Mr. Kensington had recited Mr. Vance's number to me from a small yellowed piece of paper he had tucked behind an old photograph on his nightstand. I didn't call from the house. I walked for a good distance before stopping at a small roadside cafe and borrowing the owner's phone, claiming mine was dead. At first, the man on the other end was silent as I introduced myself. But when I mentioned Mr. Kensington's name and said it was an urgent matter of life and death, his tone changed instantly. He said curtly, "This afternoon, 3 p.m. The coffee shop at the end of Main Street. Come alone, at exactly 3 p.m. I was at that coffee shop, my heart pounding the entire way. The man sitting in the corner wore a gray button-down shirt, his hair streaked with silver. His expression was serious, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He didn't waste time with small talk, just sat silently as I retrieved the USB drive. I pushed it across the table with a trembling hand. He plugged it into a tablet he had brought with him, and watched each clip slowly, his expression barely changing. Only after listening to the recording of Dr. Evans and the one of Martha discussing the medication did he close the device and look up at me. The first thing he said was, "If you don't see this through to the end, you will have no way out." His words made my heart sink. He was right. At this point, I was no longer an innocent bystander. Once they knew I had heard, seen, and held the evidence, they wouldn't let me live in peace. I wrung my hands together, my lips dry. "Mr. Vance watched me for a moment, then lowered his voice. But if we do see it through, we still have a chance to win." Right there in that coffee shop, the three of us, or rather Mr. Vance and my father-in-law with me as the intermediary, began to outline the plan. It had to be clean, discreet, and perfectly timed. First, we would stage a death that looked natural, not a sudden event that would raise suspicion, but a gradual decline consistent with his long-term illness. I would continue to report to David and Martha that he was getting weaker, eating less, his breathing becoming labored. At the right moment, I would make an urgent call, sending them scrambling back home. When the family was gathered, my father-in-law would lie perfectly still, as if he were at death's door. The more complacent they became, the more they would reveal their true nature. And at that exact moment, all the evidence would be presented right there in that house, leaving them no room to lie or deny. Mr. Vance would arrive at the precise time, bringing copies of the evidence, some documents Mr. Vance's Kensington had prepared in advance, and backup if needed. The plan sounded straightforward, but as I thought about the details, I realized how terrifying it would be to execute. If my acting wasn't convincing, if my eyes betrayed me for just a second, if they came home earlier than expected, or if someone entered the house before we were ready, everything would fall apart. And if the plan failed, the consequences could be irreversible. In the days that followed, I lived in a constant state of fear, forcing myself to be strong. I practiced in the mirror how to speak with a worried, hoarse voice, how to maintain a devastated expression, how to answer hesitantly when David called. Sometimes, looking at my reflection, I felt like a stranger. The woman staring back was no longer the submissive Sarah, but she wasn't exactly strong either, just someone who had been pushed so far she couldn't retreat another inch. My father-in-law, on the other hand, grew calmer as the day approached. Once my hand was shaking so much while feeding him soup that I spilled a few drops on the blanket. He just looked at me and said softly, "Don't be too scared. The one who panics is the one who loses first." His words made me feel both ashamed and sad. A man who had been a victim for years was now the one comforting me, when he was the one who deserved all the fear in the world. And then finally the call came. That afternoon my phone rang. It was David. As soon as I answered, he spoke, his voice curt and cold. "We're coming home earlier than planned. Prepare yourself." Just that one sentence, but it felt like a blade scraping against my skin. There was no inquiry, no hint of distress, just a notification as if he were returning not to see his dying father but to check on a piece of unfinished business. I held the phone and slowly turned to look at my father-in-law. He was lying still, but when our eyes met, he gave a slight nod. No words were needed. That nod was enough for me to understand. The time had come. I took a deep breath. For the first time in my life, I was willingly stepping into a battle not to endure but to end it all. That night, I barely slept a wink. I was keeping watch over my father-in-law and listening for the sound of a car at the gate. Around 3 a.m., the beam of headlights swept across the front yard, followed by the screech of brakes in the quiet night. My heart seized. I knew they were back. The front door burst open, and David and Martha strode in their faces, completely unlike those of people who had just cut a vacation short for a family emergency. There were no frantic questions, no looks of panic. They just quickly changed their shoes, exchanged a glance, and rushed straight into my father-in-law's room as if they were running to inspect something that was about to become theirs. I stood at the doorway, forcing myself to look exhausted, my eyes dark-rimmed as if from days without sleep. Martha brushed past me without a single word. As soon as she entered, she leaned over the bed to look at her husband's face, then her eyes darted around the room, checking for anything unusual. David stood at the foot of the bed, his gaze fixed on his father, his expression as taut as a violin string. It wasn't a look of sorrow. It was a look of impatience. A few minutes later, he whirled around, grabbed me forcefully, and pulled me into a corner near the wardrobe. His hand squeezed my wrist, the pressure painful. His voice was a hiss, low, but sharp as a knife. "Did you let anyone in the house? Did you snoop around?" I looked up, feigning genuine shock. "What are you talking about? I've just been worried about Dad." David stared into my eyes for a long time, as if trying to peel back my skin to see how much I knew. But then he let go, just giving a suspicious jerk of his chin. I rubbed my wrist, keeping my face pale with fatigue, my heart sinking as I realized I was standing in the most dangerous spot on this chessboard. Out in the room, Martha was still there, her eyes scanning everything. She looked at the medicine bottle, the nightstand drawer, even the chair where I usually sat. Her gaze sent a chill through me. It wasn't the look of a wife who had rushed home for her dying husband. It was the look of someone terrified of arriving one step too late and losing her opportunity. Less than 20 minutes later, Dr. Evans appeared. He arrived so quickly that I had to clench my fists inside my pockets to keep my expression from changing. It was strange enough for a doctor to make a house call in the middle of the night, but he came as if he had been waiting just around the corner. He walked in with his familiar black bag, gave Martha a subtle nod. So subtle he thought no one would notice, but I was standing right there. I saw it. He sat on the edge of the bed, took my father-in-law's wrist to check his pulse, glanced at the blood pressure monitor, and listened to his chest with a stethoscope, all with a great show of professionalism. The room was deathly quiet. After a moment, he let out a sigh and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "His condition is very bad. The family should prepare for the worst." At those words, Martha immediately buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as if she were trying to hold back sobs. But as I bent down to pretend to adjust the blanket, I heard her gently tug on David's sleeve. The two of them then stepped out into the hallway, leaving the door slightly ajar. Through that crack, I heard her voice a sharp whisper. "If it's over tonight, we'll get the paperwork done tomorrow. Don't let him wake up and change his mind." My blood ran cold. If this had been the old me, I would have been so shocked I might have dropped something. But now I just kept my head down, pretending to wipe my father-in-law's hand with a cloth. I felt a mix of fear and disgust. Fear because they were so brazen they no longer bothered to hide, and disgust because the woman who had just uttered those words outside walked back in, seconds later with red-rimmed eyes and a pained expression. Looking for all the world like a wife about to lose her husband. David was the same. He returned to the room, his expression softened, and he walked over to me, his voice as smooth as honey. "Sarah, you've been through so much these past few days. Let me take over. You go get some rest." To an outsider, he would have looked like a caring husband. But I knew better. That sudden gentleness had only one meaning: they wanted me out of this room, away from his father, so they could finish what they had started. Before I could reply, my father-in-law on the bed suddenly opened his eyes, a slit. He let out a weak gasp, his lips moving with great effort, his voice a threadbare whisper. "Sarah, don't go." Just those 3 words brought the entire room to a halt. I saw Martha's face twitch in annoyance, and David's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. Even in his dying moments, his father had called for me, not his own son. That enraged them more than any accusation. I quickly took his hand, leaning in close, my voice trembling. "I'm here, Dad. I'm not going anywhere." On the outside, I was playing the part of a terrified daughter-in-law, but inside I knew he was telling me to hold my ground, not to let them push me out. But Martha wasn't one to give up easily. Later that night, after making a show of sitting by her husband's bedside for a while, she began summoning me to the kitchen for one task after another. Make ginger tea, cook some thin soup, rewash the dishes because we have guests, and the kitchen is a mess. None of it was urgent, but she piled on the demands, all to keep me away from the bedroom for as long as possible. As I walked down the stairs, I heard David close the bedroom door behind me. Every step felt heavy. I knew they were making their move. On the night of their supposed family reunion, I understood one thing with chilling clarity: they hadn't come home to save him. They had come home to wait for him to die. That thought hammered in my head as I stood in the kitchen, stirring the thin soup Martha had ordered. My hand held the ladle, my eyes watched the bubbling liquid, but my ears were strained, listening for every sound from upstairs. The large house was so quiet it was suffocating, the quiet of a place anticipating a disaster, not a family with a sick loved one. I had just turned off the stove, not even having time to ladle the soup into a bowl, when David's frantic shout echoed from upstairs. "Mom, Sarah, Dad's having another episode. Call the doctor." The scream made me jump, my hand shaking so badly the ladle clattered to the floor. Without even putting the bowl on a tray, I sprinted up the stairs, my heart pounding. I burst through the bedroom door to see my father-in-law lying motionless, his face pale, his eyes closed. The heart monitor by the bed beeped rapidly a few times, then slowed dramatically. The sound of that intermittent beep, 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 made my legs go weak. I stumbled toward the bed. Dad, Dr. Evans, who had somehow entered the house again, was already there with his black bag. He took my father-in-law's wrist, listened to his heart, then turned to Martha and David, his voice grave. "It's critical. The family must be prepared." As soon as he said it, Martha clutched her chest and cried out while David stood frozen at the edge of the bed, his hands in his hair like a grief-stricken son. But I looked closely and saw that it was all too perfect, too well-timed, too neat, like a scene from a rehearsed play. Less than 10 minutes later, as I sat by the bed holding my father-in-law's hand, Martha suddenly whirled on me. Her eyes were bloodshot, her voice a shriek that tore through the room. I knew it. The day she started taking care of him was the day this house lost its peace. Before I could even process what she meant, David reached into the trash can by the table, pulled out an unfamiliar blister pack of pills and threw it at my feet. He snarled, his voice thick with fake outrage. "What is this? Who gave this medicine to my father?" I looked down, my mind reeling as if I'd been struck. It wasn't the medication I had been using. The pack was new, but the foil backing had been partially peeled, as if someone had deliberately taken out a few pills. In a flash, I understood. This was a setup. Fake medicine, fake evidence, a fake crime scene. They had prepared everything, just waiting for this moment to throw it in my face. I looked up, and before I could speak, Martha erupted into theatrical sobs. She beat her chest and ran toward the door, yelling, "Neighbors, oh my God!" The daughter-in-law tried to harm her husband, and now she's harmed his father too. Her voice was so sharp that within minutes the next-door neighbors and a few relatives who lived nearby had crowded into the yard. Some were whispering before they even entered the room. What happened? Others stood in the hallway tutting. I knew that girl had a shifty look about her. In an instant, the sick room turned into a marketplace. People shuffled in and out, the sound of their slippers scraping the floor, their whispers, their sighs, their exclamations. All eyes were on me, as if I were a criminal caught in the act. I sat by the bed, still holding my father-in-law's hand, my own palm cold and clammy. Not because I was afraid of being scolded, but because I saw with absolute clarity what they wanted. They didn't just want him dead. They wanted his death to be the knife that severed my own lifeline. David suddenly lunged at me, grabbing my shoulders and shaking me so hard my head swam. "I trusted you all these years," he roared, his voice choked with fake sobs. "I never knew you could be so evil." To an outsider, his words would have sounded genuinely heartbroken. But to me, they just made me want to laugh with disgust. I looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time, no longer flinching. My voice was hoarse, but every word was clear. "You're a very good actor. It's a shame you don't use that talent to be a decent human being." The room fell silent. No one had expected me to say that. Even David was stunned for a second, but only a second. Then he raised his hand and slapped me across the face with all his might. The sound cracked through the room. My ears rang, my vision went dark, and I stumbled sideways, the corner of my lip stinging. I raised a hand to my mouth and felt the stickiness of blood on my fingertips. Martha immediately fanned the flames. "Call the police!" she shrieked, pointing at me. "This kind of person needs to rot in jail. Every minute she's in this house is a disaster waiting to happen." The onlookers buzzed with even more fervor. A cousin even chimed in. "Giving a sick man the wrong medicine. That's murder, isn't it?" I heard it all, but strangely, a cold calm settled over me. The coldness of someone who has seen the absolute depths of evil and is no longer shocked. At that moment of peak chaos, the sound of leather shoes on tile echoed from the doorway. Mr. Howard Vance had arrived. He stood at the entrance with two other men in dark suits. He didn't enter immediately, just stood there, his eyes taking in the entire scene. Martha's crocodile tears, David clutching the pill packet, Dr. Evans scribbling in a notebook with a look of feigned gravity. I clutched my burning cheek, the taste of blood in my mouth, but my eyes were fixed on Mr. Vance. He remained perfectly still, as if waiting for the perfect ripe moment to bring down the curtain. Dr. Evans had started to sign off on his preliminary report, telling David, "I'm noting the condition is suspected to be from incorrect medication, so we can proceed with the next steps." Hearing that, I finally understood their full plan. It wasn't just about stealing his assets. It was about framing me for murder to silence me forever. The moment that thought solidified in my mind, Mr. Vance took a step into the room. His voice wasn't loud, but each word landed like a shard of ice. Why the rush to sign? Afraid the dead might come back to life. The air in the room went still. The pen, in Dr. Evans' hand, froze mid-stroke. Martha whirled around her face, paling for a split second before she puffed up her chest. "Who are you to barge into my house? This is a family matter. What right do you have to interfere?" Before Mr. Vance could answer, a hand on the bed behind me suddenly moved. Just one movement, but it was enough to silence every sound in the room. The hand grasped the edge of the white sheet and pulled it down. Then, before dozens of stunned wide eyes, my father-in-law propped himself up on his elbows and sat up. The first scream came from a female relative at the door. A glass of water slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the floor. Martha stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall, her mouth hanging open. David stood as if struck by lightning, the color draining from his face, his lips trembling. My father-in-law sat upright in bed. His face was still pale, but his eyes were blazing. His voice was hoarse from his illness, but each word was like steel. "I'm not even dead yet, and you're all fighting to bury me." No one could answer. The room was frozen in time. David stared at his father, his throat working a few times before he managed to choke out a broken sentence. "Dad, I thought." He didn't get to finish. My father-in-law slammed his hand down on the bed frame. The sound was sharp and decisive, startling even me. "You thought I was dead," he snarled. "So you could swallow all my assets and pin the crime on Sarah, is that it?" His voice wasn't loud, but each word was a slap in David's face. I stood right beside the bed and could hear his ragged breathing, see the sweat beading on his forehead in the stark white light. Martha was the first to recover. Just as I had expected, she changed her tune in the blink of an eye. From someone who had just been screaming for the police, she rushed to the bedside, her eyes welling up with fake tears, her voice choked with emotion. "Arthur, oh Arthur, you're awake. We're so happy. I was so worried I thought you were. Why are you talking to me like a stranger? I was worried sick about you." If I hadn't heard the recordings, if I hadn't just witnessed her false accusations, perhaps even I would have been fooled by that voice. But my father-in-law was not. He turned to look at her, his gaze so cold it made me shiver. He ground out the words through his teeth. "Shut up. Your performance for the world is over. Don't you dare try it on me." At his words, the room fell silent again. The relatives who had been pointing fingers at me just moments ago now stood like statues, not daring to interfere. The tension was so thick I felt that even a deep breath could make everything explode. Just then, Mr. Vance walked fully into the room and placed his briefcase on a small table by the window. He took out a small device, turned it on, and pointed it at the white wall opposite the bed. A few seconds later, an image appeared. It wasn't a movie. It was a view of this very room, from a high hidden angle no one had noticed. I heard a collective gasp from the people at the door as the wall clearly displayed footage of David sneaking into the room in the middle of the night, opening the medicine cabinet and swapping the pills in his father's tray. The next clip showed Martha standing near the door, whispering to Dr. Evans. The audio was too faint to hear from a distance, but then Mr. Vance pressed another button, and the sound came through a small speaker. Martha's voice filled the room crystal clear. "If anything happens to him tomorrow, you just write that it's suspected to be from incorrect medication. Don't let it lead to anything else." I glanced at Dr. Evans. His face had gone from white to a sickly gray, his hand holding the report trembling. The relatives in the hallway began to murmur no longer with the tone of righteous condemnation toward me, but with the shocked confusion of people who had just realized they'd been led like sheep. But Mr. Vance wasn't finished. He played another clip. This time it was audio only. Martha's sharp voice echoed through the crowded room again. "Just let her take care of the old man. When it's over, we can just kick her out." That was immediately followed by David's low, cold voice. "If he dies sooner, all the better." I had heard these words before, but hearing them alone in the dead of night was completely different from hearing them now in a room full of people. Now each word was a public indictment spoken before relatives, before the doctor, before the very man they had conspired to harm. There was no room for denial. David suddenly roared like a cornered animal. He lunged for the mini projector, trying to snatch it, but the two men who had come with Mr. Vance moved swiftly, grabbing his arms. David struggled, his face, beet red veins popping in his neck, cursing incoherently. I stood there watching the man who had been my husband, his face contorting with rage, and heard him scream a sound laced with fury and disbelief. "You'd play dirty with your own son." The words stung even me, not out of pity for him, but because even now he didn't see that he was wrong. In his mind, being exposed by his father was a dirty trick, not the consequence of his own evil actions. My father-in-law let out a short, bitter laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was as painful as a knife cut. He looked at David, his voice low with a weariness that surpassed anger. "When did you ever see me as your father?" The question fell into the room so heavy that no one could speak. In just a few minutes, this house had transformed from a place of family gathering into a courtroom for greed itself. I thought that was the end of it. The evidence was presented, the culprits exposed, the masks of Martha, David, and Dr. Evans had been ripped off in front of everyone. But no, my father-in-law's final blow was even more devastating. So devastating that even now, the memory makes my skin prickle. Mr. Kensington leaned against the headboard, his breathing a little labored, but his eyes were still bright with intensity. He glanced at Mr. Vance, his voice low but firm. "Open the black briefcase." Mr. Vance nodded, placed the leather case on the table, slowly undid the latches, and pulled out a thick file of documents, all neatly clipped together, each page bearing a notarized stamp. My heart began to pound again. Martha, still reeling from the exposure, saw the file and her face grew even paler. David stopped struggling, his eyes fixed on the documents like a dying man staring at a well, not knowing if it held water or an abyss. Mr. Kensington looked directly at his son, each word delivered slowly, cold to the bone. "You thought I was holding on to that $10 million just to be divided up. You're wrong. That $10 million was just the bait I used to lure you in." The room fell silent once more. Even the people at the door seemed to hold their breath. I stood frozen. It turned out that even the money he had given me that night was part of a much larger game. Mr. Vance began to read from the documents, his voice steady and clear. The $10 million was merely the most visible part of the estate, the part Martha and David thought they had in their grasp, which was why they had pursued it so obsessively. But the entirety of his old stock shares 2 prime commercial properties, and even this very house had been quietly transferred into a trust months ago. The legal trustee with power of attorney was none other than Mr. Howard Vance. In other words, even if Mr. Kensington had truly died tonight, Martha and David would not have been able to take everything as they had planned. All the legal avenues had been sealed off long ago. For years, they had been trying to push a man to his grave, only to find they were chasing a piece of bait he had intentionally set out to expose their hearts. Hearing this, Martha truly lost her mind. She shoved people aside and lunged toward the bed, her face contorted, her voice cracking. "You're a monster. To be so suspicious of your own wife and son. Are you even human?" At any other time, an outsider might have pitied her. But after everything that had been revealed, her cries were just grotesquely shameless. "Mr. Kensington looked at her, his expression no longer angry, just filled with a soul-crushing weariness. "No," he replied calmly, his quiet words more painful than any shout. "I was just protecting myself from the people who wanted to kill me." His sentence cut through her shrieking. She opened her mouth to argue, but only a few choked, meaningless sounds came out. Just then, Dr. Evans began to inch quietly toward the door, trying to slip away while everyone was distracted. But Mr. Vance was not about to let him escape. He pulled out another stack of papers and held them up for all to see. "Where are you going in such a hurry, Dr. Evans?" "Hoping to leave before I read these bank statements." "Dr." Evans froze, his face ashen. "Mr." Vance flipped through the pages slowly but surely. They were copies of bank transfers from Martha's account to Dr. Evans' personal account, spanning 2 years. Some were for tens of thousands, others for over 100,000, all coinciding with times when Mr. Kensington's health had taken a sudden, inexplicable turn for the worse. Seeing this, Martha immediately started arguing. "I was just giving the doctor gifts to thank him for treating my husband. What's the big deal?" Before she could finish, Mr. Vance cut in his words, sharp as a razor. "A thank you gift with the transfer description. Old dose not enough. Must increases." That sentence set the room ablaze. The relatives who had been on the fence were now completely speechless. Some even backed away as if afraid of being too close to such evil. Dr. Evans' lips trembled and his legs looked ready to buckle. Cornered, David finally dropped his good son, good husband mask. He roared like a wounded animal, his eyes bloodshot, veins bulging in his neck. "Fine, I needed the money, so what? My whole life you never respected me. All you cared about was power and money. I always had to beg to live in your shadow." The words poured out of him, filled with resentment and greed, raw and terrifying. Mr. Kensington looked at his son for a long time, his eyes no longer angry but filled with the pain of a man facing the greatest failure of his life. He spoke quietly. "I could give you money, David. But I couldn't give you a conscience. You threw that away yourself." The words were the final blow to David's madness. He whirled on me, pointing a finger, his voice venomous as if he wanted to tear me apart. "And you, if you hadn't interfered, this would have all been over." I raised a hand and wiped the dried blood from the corner of my mouth. I took a step forward. No more shaking, no more choking on my words. I looked him straight in the eye for the first time without flinching. "I didn't interfere. You were just so evil that God wouldn't let you succeed." Just then, the sound of a car screeching to a halt and hurried footsteps echoed from outside. Several police officers appeared at the door, summoned by a call made in conjunction with the file Mr. Vance had prepared in advance. The room, which had been filled with accusations and sobs, erupted into true chaos. At the sight of the police, Martha collapsed to the floor. David continued to struggle and curse, his face purple with rage. Dr. Evans stood trembling like a leaf, his black bag falling to the floor with a thud. I had always thought the day I was vindicated would be a day of tears. But it wasn't. As I watched them being handcuffed, I just felt a deep, profound cold, as if I had finally woken up from a very long nightmare. After they were led away, I stood in the middle of the living room for a long time. I didn't cry, didn't speak, and didn't feel the sense of triumph I had imagined. It was the feeling of having survived a massive storm, leaving my mind empty, my ears still ringing with the echoes of shouting and weeping. The once noisy, oppressive house was now utterly silent, filled only with the smell of medicine, sweat-spilled tea, and a bone-deep emptiness. In the aftermath, David, Martha, and Dr. Evans were all investigated. Their crimes could no longer be hidden, and I, who had gone from a daughter-in-law accused of murder, suddenly became the key witness, recounting every detail, every day, every pill, every phone call. I no longer bowed my head in submission, but I didn't feel strong either. I just felt tired, like someone who had dragged themselves over a road of sharp rocks, only to look down and see their feet had been bleeding all along. A few days later, when things had settled down, Mr. Vance brought a new set of documents to my father-in-law. Mr. Kensington sat on his bed, flipping through them slowly. Then he called me over, placed the file on the table, his voice hoarse but clear. "I've nullified everything I can regarding David's inheritance. As for this," he pushed the old file from that fateful night toward me. "This $10 million is for you, not as a charity, but as a payment for saving my life." I looked at the papers, then at him. In the past, I would have refused out of fear, not wanting to be entangled with money again. But after everything, I understood this was more than just money. It was about trust, a belated compensation from a father who had seen the true nature of people's hearts. Even so, I gently pushed the file back. "I took care of you, because I cared not for money. If you truly trust me, let me help you manage everything and get it in order. We can figure out the rest later." Mr. Kensington didn't reply immediately. He just looked at me for a long time. In his tired eyes, I saw something well up, like a grief that had been held back for years. Perhaps it had been too long since he had heard a sentence in this house that wasn't about fighting, calculating, or owning. Perhaps he himself never expected that the person who would stand by him in the end was the daughter-in-law he could only watch with helpless eyes for so many years. One morning after that, the air was calm and a soft sun fell on the porch. On the small wooden table where my father-in-law used to drink his tea before his illness, he now sat again. After all those years, he was leaning back in a wicker chair holding a warm cup. He called me out to sit with him. The early breeze rustled the potted plants, and the quiet was so complete you could hear the leaves brushing against each other. He looked out at the yard for a long time before speaking. My greatest mistake was raising my son with money but forgetting to teach him how to be a man. By the time I realized it, it was too late. I sat beside him, my heart heavy. I didn't know how to comfort him. Some pains can't be soothed with a few kind words, especially the pain of a father pushed to the brink by his own son. I just answered softly, more honest than any platitude. The fact that it still hurts means it's not entirely too late, Dad. He turned to look at me and gave a small nod. We didn't say anything more after that, but the silence wasn't heavy. It was like a wound that had just been cleaned, still sore, still aching, but at least it was no longer festering under a dirty bandage. My story didn't end with a celebration. There was no victory party, no clear sense of winning or losing. Justice was served eventually, but the cuts inflicted by your own family don't just heal because justice is done. Every time I walk past my old bedroom, I still remember the sting of David's slap, the look in Martha's eyes as she screamed at me, the feeling of being turned into a criminal in the very house I had once cleaned and cared for. Those things don't disappear overnight, so I decided to move out for a while. Not because I was angry and wanted to cut ties, but because I knew I needed space to heal myself. I did not go back to my old marriage, nor did I let anyone pull me back into the role of a woman who just grits her teeth and endures. Some things once broken only cut you deeper if you try to piece them back together. My father-in-law began his real recovery. This time, he didn't have to pretend to be weak or ignorant. He started physical therapy little by little. He grimaced when it hurt, rested when he was tired, but he persisted. Watching him use his own hands to push himself up to a standing position in the pale sunlight of the yard, I often felt my eyes sting. That man was finally getting to live the rest of his life as a real person, not as a shadow waiting for others to decide his fate. The day before I moved out, he called me into his room. He didn't talk about paperwork or assets. He just placed his hand over mine, his thin hand, surprisingly warm, and said in a very soft voice, "From now on, if you don't mind, just call me Dad." At those words, a lump formed in my throat. I turned away quickly, afraid he would see my eyes were red. After all my years as a daughter-in-law, I finally received a true dad when everything had already been torn apart. But maybe that's just how life is sometimes. Some things arrive very late, but late is better than never. Looking back now, I understand that just because someone has the title of family doesn't mean they will love you. Some people are physically close, but their hearts are colder than a stranger's. But sometimes it's in the midst of complete devastation that you finally see who is truly worth keeping in your life. I lost a marriage and I lost years of my life to what felt like meaningless suffering, but I found my self-respect. And for me, that was a salvation of its own.